In a controversial move, the United States will supply Ukraine with cluster bombs. And in another development we're looking at, is President Joe Biden under pressure to step aside? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. As the 2024 U.S. presidential election draws closer, a number of voices are urging Joe Biden to make way for a new, younger generation of Democratic candidates. They point to his advanced age and what some say are cognitive issues. But his supporters say Biden should be judged by his achievements, not his age. We'll get into that in just a few minutes, but first to a controversial decision by the Biden administration to equip Ukraine with cluster munitions.
And it was a very difficult decision on my part. And by the way, I discussed this with our allies, discussed this with our friends up on the Hill.
The decision has caused divisions domestically and concern among U.S. allies. These munitions release dozens of bomblets, which spread out and detonate across an area nearly the size of several football fields. They're considered inaccurate, indiscriminate, and have been banned by more than 100 nations. For more on this story, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist. From New York, we're joined by Brian Becker. He is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. We also have Joseph Williams. He is a former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. And Gene Rossi is a former assistant U.S. attorney and federal prosecutor. Welcome to all of you to the show. Gene Rossi, as I said, there's been widespread criticism of this decision by the Biden administration to supply Ukraine with these cluster munitions, and the criticism has been both domestic and international. Now, in order to do so, President Biden had to sign a waiver, and that waiver enables him, according to the BBC, to bypass a U.S. law that prohibits the production, use, or transfer of cluster munitions with a failure rate of more than 1%. And we know that these munitions do have a failure rate of more than 1%. So the question is, how was the president able to bypass this? And the other question is, why have rules like this or laws like this if they can be so easily bypassed?
Well, the Congress over the years has given the President of the United States wide discretion on how to implement either a war or a conflict where we are helping the allies. That's point number one. Point number two, I will say this, and I support President Biden, but this does sort of tarnish the integrity and the good name of the United States abroad if we're doing this and having a waiver. The third point this suggests to me is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not going as well as we would hope. And that's probably why we have this waiver by the President of the United States.
So just to be clear, the United States president is not in any way violating the country's laws?
No, he has wide discretion under the statute, under the laws, to implement a war as he or she sees fit. And I think you can disagree with the waiver, but I think he has the ability to do that. I just have concern about our good name and also the signal it sends that this is sort of a sign of weakness that we are giving them these types of bombs. That suggests to me that that counteroffensive is not moving with alacrity that we hoped it would.
Adolfo Franco, let's look at the opinions on the Republican side. There are, of course, Republicans who support the president, others oppose him. But let's listen to someone that supports the president's actions. This is the House Foreign Affairs Chairman, Michael McCaul. Let's watch.
They do not want these to be used in Russia. They want these as self-defense to use against Russians in their own country of Ukraine. I don't see anything wrong with that because, quite honestly, Jake, as you look at the counteroffensive, it's been slowed tremendously because this administration has been so slow to get the weapons in. These weapons would be a game changer.
So, Adolfo, what's your opinion on what's taking place right now?
Well, my opinion is I think this is a very tough call, but there's a politics and then there's the issue involving more than anything else the actual use of these weapons. First, I have to agree with Gene. First of all, in the conduct of foreign policy and certainly the conduct of war, with very few limitations, the statutes provided, and that's the realm of the president. He's absolutely right about that. The thing is, though, is the contradiction here. This is a little bit of the politics. 2 years ago, Jen Psaki, when she was an official in the Biden administration, said the use of cluster bombs by anyone would be a war crime. So I guess we're committing war crimes according to that standard at the time. Secondly, I think the president, that's another segment coming up here, is his judgment is clouded and his judgment is poor. In a television interview, he said that munitions were low, not only in Ukraine, but in the United States. This is something I don't think you publicize. It certainly is true that the war is going poorly in Ukraine. And now this escalation, I think, needs to be asked by whether Republicans or Democrats is what's the end game here? Because again, 2 years ago, this was a war crime. Remember when we were talking about air support and so forth, it was off the table? So these questions need to be asked, and I don't think there is a clear game plan. It's day by day. The president also said he's conferred with the allies. I watched an interview last night on Spanish television from Spain. The Spanish foreign minister, she was extremely critical of the decision of the United States, and Spain is a key ally. Lastly, I think this has been poorly handled, and it wouldn't have been this way in the Trump administration. I think the amount of assistance, particularly on the armaments from our European allies, should have been demanded to be much higher than they are now. The president is now saying that we're low on munitions. We have been for some time even before this conflict. So a lot of questions here about the conduct of this war, which there is no clear plan for the role of the United States. It's a day-by-day decisions that are being made, and I think this is very dangerous for the country.
So, Adolfo, you talked there about an end game. What happens if these cluster munitions don't do what the United States and the Ukrainians hoped they would do, push the Russians back?
Well, that's exactly the right question to ask. It is what is next? What type of steps the United States is willing to take? One of them, for example, I know this sounds crazy, but Ukraine is now requesting quite strongly that it be allowed to be a member of NATO. Of course, that would be Article 5. Everybody in NATO would then have to be involved in this conflict. So this is why we need to think this through. Ukrainian demands in the past have been initially rebuffed and then accepted. So the answer to your question is this then more air support of some sort that we lend the Ukrainians, and ultimately is what is the role, the defined role of the United States? It continues to be incrementally one of more engagement, not less.
Yeah, and let's not forget that Russia is, of course, a nuclear power.
Correct.
Brian Becker, this planned supply of cluster munitions to Ukraine has been clouded in some pretty bizarre arguments. There was an editorial in this morning's New York Times which said that the international community finds this action by the US government, quote, morally repugnant. And using that logic, I mean, are they weapons then that are morally acceptable?
Good point. I mean, these weapons are they're war crimes, inherently war crimes, because they're indiscriminate weapons. The Geneva Convention, which governs the rules of law, requires all the parties at war to take serious, sustained, and comprehensive measures to protect civilian life. As you said in the beginning, cluster bombs, when dropped, they explode above the surface of the earth, and then they spread out like two football fields long and wide. They were heavily used in Laos. They're still exploding in Laos. 50 years later, kids are getting their legs blown off because the U.S. illegally used cluster bombs against the people of Laos. Again, these are criminal weapons. They should be prohibited, and frequently are prohibited. Let's look at what's really happened here. President Obama said, "Don't send Javelin missiles." That was back during the Obama administration. And then President Trump was impeached for slowing down the sending of Javelin missiles. Then when the war started, Joe Biden said no M1 Abrams tanks. Then there were M1 Abrams tanks. There weren't going to be F-16 fighter jets. Then there were F-16 fighter jets. And now there's cluster bombs. And by the way, for our audience and for our guests, the U.S. is not technically Congress, according to the U.S. Constitution, if we are live by the rule of law, the U.S. Constitution says that only Congress can declare war. Now, U.S. government since the World War II has violated that routinely, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. government, the president, has the latitude to break law and break international law simply because of going to war without a declaration of war from Congress. This is a dangerous escalation. When you look at the track record of one escalation after another, we said we're not going to do it, then we do it. We're not going to do it, and then we do it. Where are we going? Where is this all leading? This is a proxy war with Russia. It's a war that can't be won. It's an unwise war. The United States, if it really cares about Ukrainians, instead of dropping cluster bombs in Ukraine, which will undoubtedly hit Ukrainian civilians, the U.S. should go back to the negotiating table and really come to terms with Russia's very legitimate and valid security concerns that it doesn't want U.S. missiles, conventional and nuclear weapons placed on its border.
Joseph Williams, these cluster munitions have a high failure rate. Many fail to detonate. It's called the dud rate. And yet we know that years after the US used these weapons, as Brian was pointing out a moment ago in the case of Laos, decades in some instances, they continue to cause death and destruction. In fact, 1/3 of those killed by cluster munitions are children, according to the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor. So what are we to make of the statement by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, trying to justify this action by the Biden administration? He said, Ukraine has promised us that they'd be really careful and they would only be used in Ukraine, nowhere else.
Promise. Promise, cross my heart and hope to die. We won't drop them on any civilian areas. Look, far be it from me to defend cluster munitions. They're among the most reprehensible munitions ever used in war, ever created. But if we're going to look at Biden's calculus here, and by that I emphasize calculus alone, I'm not justifying the use of these weapons at all. They are destroying children even some 50 years after the Vietnam War has ended. But if you're looking at his calculations, the war is not progressing as quickly as possible. It is, if you squint, a proxy war with Russia. Ukraine has not gotten a lot of the stuff on its wish list in a prompt and timely manner. This supposedly is supposed to be one way to advance Ukrainians' interests, therefore protect Western Europe, therefore defeat the war and end it as quickly as possible. I mean, the sound kind of calculus used when we dropped the atomic weapon in Hiroshima to end the war quickly, save lives. That's the theory that they're operating under. The other theory that they're operating under is that since the Vietnam War, since the end of the Vietnam War, these cluster munitions have become more advanced and more precise, which is kind of an oxymoron if you look at it too closely. The third point they're trying to make is that the U.S. has used the munitions in Afghanistan and Iraq, so within the last half of the 21st century, and the Russians are currently using these cluster munitions as we speak. So if you look at all these calculations, you can kind of understand why Biden came to the conclusion that he did, and why Jake Sullivan is trying to emphasize that this will be a safe use of cluster munitions. The U.S. is going to keep track of them, so the Ukrainians, and both countries are supposed to be involved in a cleanup effort at the end of the war. The question is, when is that war going to end? When does that cleanup happen? And if the administrations change hands before the war ends, whose responsibility is it going to be to clean up those munitions once the war is over?
Gene Rossi, the United States is not a signatory to that convention which bans the use of cluster munitions. Neither is Russia, neither is Ukraine, and Ukraine and Russia have both used cluster munitions in this conflict already. Why did the U.S. not sign that convention?
For the reasons we're talking about it today. We wanted the flexibility, and it goes to what Adolfo said. I agree with him, he agrees with me. The President of the United States, he or she, should have broad discretion on how to protect the integrity and security of the United States. Whether it's Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Obama, or Trump, they need that. They have to have that. Go back to the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln exercised broad powers to enforce the military and to win the war. So we can't take away those abilities that a president must need, because the security of the United States, we can put aside all the criticism we want. The security of the United States is paramount. And that's why we didn't sign that treaty.
Adolfo, as Gene points out, the United States president has sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, Adolfo, I'll get back to you. Talking about what Gene said, protecting the integrity and security of the United States. But as Brian Becker pointed out, the United States is not at war in this particular conflict. It's not a war against Russia because the wars are declared by Congress, and Congress has not done that.
You asking me?
Yes, Adolfo, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Adolfo is not with us. Gene, let me put that question to you.
Well, you go back to World War II. Mm-hmm. We had not declared war against either Japan or Germany. And then Pearl Harbor obviously changed the dynamic brutally. But before that war, we had allies that we were supporting, Lend-Lease. We were supporting morally, financially. We weren't in the war, but our allies were in a war. And when our friends are being attacked, we have to do everything we can to help them defend themselves. And Ukraine may be part of NATO, and the other countries around Ukraine are our allies, are our friends. And we cannot sit on our hands and allow our friends, our allies, to face the risk of having Russia, Putin, who's a maniacal dictator, take over Europe or threaten Europe. That is something we cannot accept, even if there is no declaration of war.
Adolfo, I believe you are back with us right now. Yes. I presume you were able to hear what Gene Rossi just told us. What is your view on that?
Well, I think I heard most of it, but let me say I'm in large agreement with what Gene has said here. But I question this is the politics. If this were Donald Trump that had done this, I'm not sure we'd have the degree of bipartisan support that you see for this. I just saw before this interview, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut support President Biden on this, reluctantly, but supporting President Biden for many of the reasons Gene has said. So I want to make it clear, I stand for a bipartisan foreign policy when there are times like this, and I share Gene's views. The president clearly has the legal authority to do this. There's no question under the statute. Congress can certainly legislate and limit his powers and take steps if it needs to, but he certainly has the authority to do this. And that's what we want a president to have on foreign policy largely, and then certainly on the defense matters. So this is not an illegal use of these weapons. Yeah. I will say too, just quickly, that's absolutely right. We use these weapons in Iraq and we use these weapons in Afghanistan. Yeah. I'm not justifying these weapons, but the weapons that were used 50 or 60 years ago in Laos were very different weapons. There is a difference between low grade and high grade. They're still cluster bombs. There's no question about it. And they're still a serious matter. However, I will agree with Gene on this. Yeah. The president conducts the national security of the United States, not 535 people.
Okay, and Adolfo, I think we should also remind our viewers that although those weapons that were used in Afghanistan or in Laos or in Iraq, as you point out, may have been of a lower grade, they are still killing people up to this day.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There's still cluster bombs. And I don't want to minimize it.
Right. Okay.
But there's been a big distinction because I understand the Russians are using not the low-grade ones.
Okay. Brian Becker, let's listen to what a Democrat member of the U.S. House of Representatives, her name's Barbara Lee, she was interviewed by CNN. This is what she had to say.
What I think is that we would risk losing our moral leadership, because when you look at the fact that over 120 countries have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, saying they should never be used, they should never be used.
So, Brian, I want to get back to something that Adolfo brought up earlier on, actually, because just a few months ago, the press secretary at the White House said that when Russia was using these weapons, said that this is potentially a war crime. But now it seems to be okay. I mean, is this a case of this being a crime for everybody else, except in the U.S., does it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Jen Psaki was very clear. She said using cluster bombs is a war crime. She said that during the Biden administration. And what we see here is each and every president in the United States goes to war. They go to war in Vietnam. Then they invaded Grenada, the invasion of Panama, the invasion of Iraq, the first Gulf War, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq the second time, the bombing of Libya, the bombing of NATO, the bombing of Yugoslavia. And each and every time we're told the same thing. We have to defend the country. The president must have latitude to take these kind of military actions to keep us free and keep us safe. If any other government in the world had this track record of endless war, always with a noble cause, always to protect its people, even though the last time the U.S. was invaded was the War of 1812, we would be condemning these governments. But we have this choir, this chorus of apologists for the U.S. government as it continues to carry out war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the biggest war crime of all, according to the Nuremberg, which was the crime against peace. We are involved in war after war after war. This time, it's a proxy war. That's the difference. But the U.S. is fully committed. If it wasn't for the U.S. and U.S. armaments, there would have already been a negotiated deal here.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I'll just say one last thing.
Yeah.
When Putin and the Russians amassed troops and said, we have red lines and you must negotiate with us and Ukraine will never be part of NATO, the Biden administration and Blinken and Sullivan all said calmly, yeah, the Russians are going to invade, the Russians are going to invade, but there was no sense of alarm. Why not then go back to the negotiating table and try to prevent a war? There was no desire to end the war because I think the U.S. wanted this war.
Okay, Joseph Williams, I'm going to move on to the other issue that we're going to talk about this evening, and that is the 2024 presidential election. We're hearing more and more increasing concerns by Democrats, and we hear them from Republicans as well, about President Biden's ability to continue to govern, to continue to stand to run for election. There are even questions over his cognitive abilities. What do you make of this?
It's easy to answer to that question. We've never had an octogenarian president before, and we'd never had a president who's going to be 83 years old on inauguration day should he win. So that alone is enough to cause a lot of concern. Couple that with the fact that Biden has had more than his share of gaffes, that there's a lot of attention being paid to him because of those gaffes. And despite the fact that he's had a clean bill of health, that causes a lot of concern for Democrats. Moreover, we've got a president who is an institutionalist at a time when a lot of progressives and people on the left want a president who's going to stand and fight. Now, the reason why we get a lot of chatter about California Governor Gavin Newsom is because he kind of fits that bill. He's got a youthful air about him. He's taken on Ron DeSantis punch for punch cross country in rhetorical battles, rather, something that Biden is kind of loath to do. So you put all that together, and you have a lot of thirsty Democrats who are looking for something new and a sure thing to beat Donald Trump, which Biden certainly isn't at this point in his presidency.
Gene Rossi, of course, there are those who are saying, well, look, let's not talk about Biden's age. Let's look at what he's done since becoming president. I mean, Democrats point to the low unemployment rate. It's something which is become known as Bidenomics. They point to the low unemployment rate and the most recent numbers which show more job creation. I mean, is that enough to carry him, to propel him to a second term?
Well, I'll tell you this right now, if the economy isn't perceived to be doing well by May or June of next year, Joe Biden is going to lose in a landslide because the economy drives voters. What worries me as a supporter of President Biden is that we can't laugh off or ignore the age issue. Independents are focusing on the age issue. They're focusing on what Joseph just said. President Biden will be 83 when he takes the oath of office if he's reelected. So we can't ignore it. That is why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson, they're polling, they're getting numbers. And they're not in the 30s or 40s or the 20s, but they're chiseling away at Joe Biden's support. So I see some dark clouds before the convention next summer for Joe Biden. He will get nominated, but it's not going to be a cakewalk. There's going to be some questions asked about his cognitive abilities, his gaffes, and his age. We can't ignore that. We cannot ignore that if you're a Democrat.
And you say that could cost him the election?
No, I think what will cost him the election is if the economy is perceived to be mediocre or weak by May or June next year. The age issue alone won't do it, but the age issue will complement and they'll go together if he has a perceived bad economy. That age will bring him down.
Yeah, Brian Becker, Gene just mentioned Robert Kennedy Jr., Marianne Williamson as well, but they are also so-called third-party candidates. We've got Cornel West, and there's possibly a candidate that's going to be nominated by what's known as the No Labels group. What kind of impact would that have on the election?
Well, if you look at the 2016 election and the 2020 election, in both cases, the Democrats won by a very large popular vote margin, 3 million in the case of 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. Similarly, the Democrats won by 7 million against Trump in 2020, but have narrowly won the Electoral College. So that's what makes these races very, very close. It's because of the domination of the Electoral College, this archaic part of our system.
Right.
So yeah, third parties could have a substantial impact, in fact, on the 2024 campaign. One number that's important is that only 26% of the American people, when recently polled, said they wanted Joe Biden to run again, and that only included 52% of Democrats. So the Democrats who will vote for Biden aren't really voting for the man Biden. They're not enthusiastic about him. They're voting against Trump or the Republican agenda. That's not a good sort of way to go into such a tight race in 2024.
All right, Adolfo, I've only got about a minute left, but let's talk about the Republican side. Former President Donald Trump continues to lead the Republican field by a pretty wide margin. If there is a third-party candidate, does that work in his favor?
Oh, I think a third-party candidate works in President Trump's favor. There's no question about it. And there's no question that conservatives and Republicans, at the end of the day, all the polling shows it, are going to rally behind President Trump, with very few exceptions. I have yet to see anybody, even the most vociferous critics of President Trump, among them Governor Christie, for example, say that they would vote for Joe Biden. So a third-party candidacy, or no labels, a real credible one, will definitely help or maybe even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will run this way. I think your guest, I agree with all their guests, but they were extremely charitable. It's not the age that he has, it's the way he behaves. His speaking, his inability to express himself in an articulate fashion, that's what's causing problems for President Biden.
Okay, and we need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.